What if a killer didn't just murder his victims? What if he wanted the entire world to know he did it? What if after every crime, he wrote letters to the newspapers, mocking the police, challenging investigators, and daring anyone to uncover his identity? And what if those letters contained codes so complex that even professional cryptographers struggled to solve them? In the late 1960s, Northern California was about to face exactly that nightmare. A mysterious killer began targeting young couples in isolated locations. No clear motive, no clear suspect, only a trail of fear, and a symbol that would become infamous. A circle, crossed by a vertical and horizontal line. The man who signed his letters with that symbol called himself something chilling: Zodiac. More than half a century later, the identity of the Zodiac Killer remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in criminal history. Tonight we're going deep into the evidence, the crimes, the suspects, and the terrifying possibility that the Zodiac Killer may have walked among ordinary people for years without ever being caught. But to understand the mystery, we have to go back to the night it all began. A cold December evening, a lonely road, and to teenagers who had no idea they were about to become part of history. December 20th, 1968. Christmas was only 5 days away. In the small communities around Vallejo, California, homes were decorated with lights and holiday music played on local radio stations. For most people, the evening was peaceful. But just outside the town, along a remote stretch known as Lake Herman Road, the night was dark and quiet. 17-year-old David Faraday had picked up his girlfriend, 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen. It was supposed to be a simple date. They drove out of town, heading toward the countryside where many young couples went to spend time alone. Lake Herman Road was a popular spot. Isolated, silent, perfect for privacy. David parked the car in a gravel turnout just off the road. The engine shut off. The quiet countryside surrounded them. But sometime after p.m., another car slowly approached the area. No one knows how long the driver had been watching. No one knows if the killer followed them, or simply stumbled upon them. What we do know is that moments later, gunshots shattered the silence. When police arrived at the scene, the sight was horrifying. Betty Lou Jensen had been shot multiple times while trying to run away from the car. David Faraday had been shot at close range. Both teenagers were dead. Investigators searched the area for clues, but the crime scene was strange. Nothing had been stolen. There was no sign of robbery, and there were no witnesses who could clearly identify the attacker. At first, detectives believed the murders might have been a random act of violence, but months later, they would discover something terrifying. The killer wasn't hiding, he wanted attention, and soon, he would introduce himself to the world. 7 months passed after the murders on Lake Herman Road. For investigators, the case had gone cold. There were no reliable witnesses, no fingerprints, no suspects, and slowly, the shocking double murder began fading from the headlines. Many people believed the killer had simply disappeared, but on the night of July 4th, 1969, that belief would shatter, because the man later known as the Zodiac Killer was about to strike again. A quiet night at the park. It was just after midnight. Fireworks from Independence Day celebrations had already faded into the distance. In Vallejo, California, a young couple sat parked inside a car at a quiet location called Blue Rock Springs Park. Their names were Darlene Farron and Michael Majot. Like many couples, they were simply talking, enjoying the calm night away from the crowds. The park was mostly empty, dark, peaceful. But suddenly, another car pulled into the parking lot. At first, the couple didn't think much about it. The vehicle stopped behind them for a moment, then drove away. Everything seemed normal again, but about 10 minutes later, the car returned. This time, it parked directly behind them. Its headlights shone into their car. The driver stepped out. Michael Majot later described the man walking toward them with a flashlight in his hand. For a brief moment, they thought it might be a police officer checking on them. But then something terrifying happened. Without warning, the man raised a gun. Gunshots exploded into the night. Bullets shattered the windows of the car. Michael Majot was hit multiple times. Darlene Farron was critically wounded. The attacker walked back toward his car. For a moment, it seemed like the nightmare might be over. But suddenly, the man returned. He walked back to the vehicle and fired again. More bullets tore through the car. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, the attacker disappeared into the darkness. Despite his injuries, Michael Majot survived the attack. He managed to give police a description of the attacker. He described the man as a white male, around 26 to 30 years old, with a heavy build. It wasn't much, but it was the first real description investigators had. Meanwhile, Darlene Ferrin was rushed to the hospital. Doctors fought to save her life, but sadly, she did not survive. Once again, a young couple had been targeted. Once again, the killer vanished, but this time, something even more disturbing was about to happen, because less than an hour after the attack, a phone call came into the police station. At approximately 12:40 a.m., a call was made to the Vallejo Police Department. The voice on the phone sounded calm, cold, emotionless. The caller said, "I want to report a double murder." He then gave exact directions to the crime scene at Blue Rock Springs Park. But then he said something even more shocking. He calmly admitted that he was also responsible for the Lake Herman Road murders months earlier. The line went silent. Police immediately traced the call. It came from a public phone booth just blocks away from the police station. Officers rushed to the location, but by the time they arrived, the caller was gone. The mysterious killer had once again vanished without a trace, and investigators were about to realize something terrifying. The person responsible for these crimes wasn't just killing people, he was playing a game with the police. Soon, the entire country would hear from him, because weeks later, letters began arriving at local newspapers. Letters signed by a name the world would never forget, Zodiac. The man now known as the Zodiac Killer was about to turn murder into a message, and his next move would make the case one of the most infamous unsolved mysteries in history. By the summer of 1969, investigators in Northern California were already dealing with a frightening possibility: two separate attacks, four victims, one survivor who described a mysterious attacker, but the police still had no clear suspect. The killer had disappeared again, leaving behind nothing but fear. Then, something happened that would transform the investigation forever. Because the killer was about to do something almost no murderer had done before, he decided to introduce himself to the world, and he did it through the media. The man who would soon be known as the Zodiac Killer was about to begin a terrifying conversation with the public. On August 1, 1969, 3 major newspapers in Northern California received identical envelopes. The letters were sent to the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Inside each envelope was a handwritten message. The writer claimed responsibility for the recent murders, but the letters contained something even more chilling. Each newspaper also received 1/3 of a strange coded message. The writer demanded that the newspapers publish the cipher on their front pages. If they refused, he threatened to go on a killing spree. He wrote that he would kill a dozen people over the weekend. The newspapers faced a difficult decision. Ignoring the message could lead to more deaths, but publishing it meant giving the killer exactly what he wanted: attention. In the end, the newspapers decided to print the code. The mysterious killer had forced himself into the spotlight, and soon, the entire country was trying to solve his puzzle. The coded message contained 408 strange symbols, triangles, circles, crosses, and other unusual characters. At first glance, it looked impossible to decode. Professional investigators tried to solve it. Cryptography experts examined it. Even the military looked at the puzzle. But days passed with no answers. Then something unexpected happened. A schoolteacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty Hardin began working on the code at home. They believed the killer might have used simple patterns, and after hours of analyzing the symbols, they began to see a pattern forming. Slowly, letter by letter, the message began revealing itself. When the cipher was finally decoded, the message shocked investigators. The writer claimed he enjoyed killing people. He described murder as something exciting. But the most disturbing part came near the end. The message suggested that his victims would become slaves in the afterlife. The words revealed a deeply disturbing mindset. The killer didn't just want to commit murder, he wanted to terrify society, and he wanted recognition. At the end of the letter, he introduced himself with a name that would become infamous. He signed the message with a symbol, a circle crossed by 2 lines, and beneath it, a word, Zodiac. For the first time, the public had a name for the mysterious killer. The crimes on Lake Herman Road, the attack at Blue Rock Springs, they were now connected to one identity: the Zodiac Killer. Once the letters became public, fear spread rapidly across Northern California. People began locking their doors earlier. Parents warned teenagers about staying out late. Couples who once visited quiet parks at night suddenly felt unsafe. The killer had done something incredibly effective. He had turned his crimes into a public spectacle. Every new letter became front-page news. Every new message created more fear, and the Zodiac seemed to enjoy every moment of it. But investigators were about to realize something even more disturbing, because the killer wasn't finished sending messages. In fact, his next letter would include a threat so terrifying that parents across California began fearing for their children's lives. The man calling himself the Zodiac Killer was preparing to escalate his psychological war against the public. By September 1969, Northern California was already on edge. The Zodiac Killer had struck twice, sent terrifying letters to newspapers, and even challenged the public to decode his messages. But his next attack would take terror to a new level of bold, calculated crime committed in broad daylight. The man who had previously hunted at night was now stepping into a public spotlight, daring anyone to stop him. It was September 27, 1969, a warm Saturday afternoon. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, a young couple, decided to spend the day outdoors near Lake Berryessa, about 40 miles northeast of San Francisco. They parked their car at a secluded spot by the water, enjoying the calm beauty of the lake. What they didn't know was that they were being watched. From the surrounding hills, someone observed them. Someone who had studied patterns, learned how the police worked, and was carefully planning his next move. At around 5 p.m., a man appeared wearing a black hood with the cross-circle symbol drawn on it. He carried a gun and a knife. Hartnell and Shepard froze in shock. The man approached their car, calm and methodical. He ordered them to tie themselves up with shoestrings he carried. Then, in one of the most chilling moments in the Zodiac case, he explained the rules: do exactly as he said. Any disobedience would result in death. For the first time, the killer spoke face to face with his victims, revealing a cold, methodical personality. After tying the couple, the killer stabbed them both multiple times. Brian Hartnell survived by pretending to be dead and playing along with the killer's instructions. Cecilia Shepard, however, was gravely injured. The killer left, disappearing into the hills once more. Minutes later, a nearby couple found Hartnell bleeding but alive. He led them to Cecilia, who was critically injured. She was rushed to the hospital, where she survived for several days before succumbing to her injuries. A bold signature before leaving, the Zodiac Killer did something chillingly theatrical. He carved the cross-circle symbol into Hartnell's car door, a signature that would appear in all future communications. He wanted it known that he was the same person who had attacked the previous victims. By leaving a personal mark, he not only terrified his victims, but also taunted the police and the public. This attack sent a clear message: the Zodiac Killer was escalating. He was brazen and confident. He was enjoying the fear he created. Lake Berryessa became a place of horror in Northern California. Investigators now faced a pattern, targeting young couples, attacking in secluded areas, leaving his signature, and taunting the public. The Zodiac Killer had gone beyond random killings. He had transformed murder into a psychological weapon. Communities across the region began to fear for their safety. Teenagers stopped going to parks at night, couples stayed home, and the letters from the Zodiac became even more terrifying. Because the public now understood he could attack anywhere, anytime, and no one was safe. By October 1969, fear had already spread across Northern California. The mysterious criminal known as the Zodiac Killer had attacked multiple victims, sent disturbing letters to newspapers, and even left behind a chilling symbol that became his signature. But his next move shocked investigators for a different reason. Until now, the killer had targeted couples in quiet, isolated areas, lonely roads, remote parks, places where witnesses were unlikely. But the next crime would break that pattern completely. This time, the Zodiac Killer would strike in the middle of a city, and the victim would be a man simply trying to do his job. On the evening of October 11, 1969, a 29-year-old taxi driver named Paul Stine began his shift in the city of San Francisco. It was a typical Saturday night. People were moving around the city. Restaurants were busy. Streetlights illuminated the quiet neighborhoods. At around 9:45 p.m., Paul Stine picked up a passenger in the downtown area. The man gave him directions to a neighborhood called Presidio Heights. Nothing about the ride seemed unusual. Just another passenger. Just another trip. But as the taxi reached its destination, something terrifying happened. When the taxi stopped near the corner of Washington and Cherry Street, the passenger suddenly pulled out a gun. Without warning, he shot Paul Stine at close range. The bullet struck the driver in the head. The taxi rolled slightly forward before coming to a stop. Inside the car, Paul Stine was dead. But the killer wasn't finished. Instead of fleeing immediately, the attacker calmly reached over the body. He removed part of the victim's shirt, then he stepped out of the taxi and began walking away from the scene. What the killer did not realize was that several teenagers inside a nearby house had witnessed part of the crime. From their window, they saw the man standing beside the taxi. They quickly called the police and described the suspect. Their description was simple but important: a white male, medium build, wearing dark clothing. Police officers began searching the neighborhood almost immediately, but something tragic happened during the response. The initial police radio report mistakenly described the suspect as a black male. Because of this incorrect information, officers briefly stopped searching one of the men who actually matched the killer's appearance. Later, investigators would believe that the man those officers encountered may have been the Zodiac himself. If that theory is correct, the killer may have walked right past the police and escaped. Days later, the case took another disturbing turn. A letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle. Inside the envelope was a piece of fabric. Investigators quickly realized what it was. It was part of Paul Stine's shirt. The writer of the letter claimed responsibility for the murder. And once again, the message was signed with the symbol of the Zodiac Killer. The killer had just proven something chilling. He was not afraid of cities. He was not afraid of witnesses. And he was certainly not afraid of the police. In fact, he seemed to enjoy challenging them. After the murder of Paul Stine, fear reached new levels. The Zodiac Killer had shown that he could strike anywhere. Remote roads, quiet parks, even busy neighborhoods in a major city. Police departments across California intensified their investigations. Hundreds of leads were examined, suspects were questioned, but the killer remained a ghost. The man who had murdered Paul Stine vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only fear. And another letter, and the messages from the Zodiac were about to become even more disturbing, because his next communication would contain a threat that terrified families across California. A threat involving school children. After the murder of taxi driver Paul Stine, the fear surrounding the mysterious killer reached a new level. The man known as the Zodiac Killer had proven something disturbing. He could strike in quiet countryside, and he could strike inside a busy city. But the next thing he did was even more terrifying, because instead of another murder, the Zodiac decided to use something else as his weapon: fear. And he delivered that fear through letters. Only days after the murder in San Francisco, another envelope arrived at the offices of the San Francisco Chronicle. Inside was a handwritten message. Once again, the letter included a piece of fabric taken from Paul Stine's shirt, proving the writer was truly the killer. But this time, the message contained something even more disturbing. The Zodiac wrote that he planned to attack a school bus. He described a horrifying idea. The killer claimed he might shoot the tires of a bus and then attack the children as they came running out. The threat immediately caused panic. Parents across Northern California became terrified. Schools increased security. Police began monitoring school bus routes. Every strange vehicle near a school suddenly became suspicious. Even though the attack never happened, the threat alone created widespread fear. The Zodiac Killer had found a new way to terrorize people. He didn't even need to commit a crime. Just writing about it was enough. The Zodiac didn't stop sending letters. Over the following months, more envelopes arrived at newspapers. Each message included strange symbols, puzzles, and taunts directed at the police. Investigators struggled to understand the purpose behind these communications. Some experts believed the killer was seeking attention. Others believed he wanted to prove his intelligence by challenging investigators with complex codes. Whatever his reason, the letters worked. Every message became national news. The Zodiac Killer was now one of the most talked about criminals in the country, and the mystery surrounding him only grew deeper. One of the most famous puzzles sent by the Zodiac was a 3-character cipher. For decades, the code remained unsolved. Cryptographers, mathematicians, and amateur puzzle enthusiasts all tried to crack it, but year after year, the message remained a mystery. It became one of the most famous unsolved puzzles in criminal history. For investigators, it was incredibly frustrating. The killer seemed to be laughing at them from the shadows, and every time a new letter arrived, it reminded the public of something terrifying. The man calling himself the Zodiac Killer was still out there. At this point, the Zodiac had transformed his crimes into something much larger than murder. He was waging a psychological war. The letters kept the public afraid, the codes kept investigators distracted, and the constant media coverage ensured that his name remained in headlines. In many ways, the Zodiac was controlling the narrative. He decided when the public would hear from him. he decided what new clues investigators would receive, and he seemed to enjoy every moment of it. But behind the scenes, detectives were beginning to focus their attention on several possible suspects, and one of those suspects would soon become the most controversial figure in the entire investigation. By the early 1970s, investigators had collected mountains of evidence connected to the crimes of the Zodiac Killer. There were witness descriptions, handwritten letters, cryptic ciphers, and even fingerprints recovered from the taxi murder scene in San Francisco. Despite all this information, one question still haunted investigators: who was the Zodiac Killer? Over the years, many suspects were investigated, but one name appeared again and again in police files: a man named Arthur Lee Allen. The most famous suspect, Arthur Lee Allen, lived in California and worked as a schoolteacher. Several details about him caught the attention of investigators. For example, Allen owned a watch made by a company called Zodiac. The watch featured the same cross-circle symbol that appeared in the killer's letters. Friends and acquaintances later told police that Allen had made disturbing comments about violence and hunting people. Some even claimed that he once mentioned the idea of calling himself Zodiac to detectives. These coincidences were difficult to ignore. Allen also lived relatively close to several locations connected to the murders. Because of this, police searched his home multiple times. They hoped to find evidence linking him directly to the crimes, but the searches produced no definitive proof. Although many investigators believed Allen was suspicious, the evidence simply did not confirm that he was the Zodiac Killer. Handwriting experts compared Allen's writing with the letters sent by the killer. The results were inconclusive. Fingerprint comparisons also failed to match, and when DNA testing later became possible, samples taken from Zodiac letters did not clearly identify Allen. Despite years of investigation, the case against him remained uncertain. For some detectives, Allen seemed like the perfect suspect. But without solid evidence, the mystery continued. Arthur Lee Allen was not the only person investigated. Over the years, police examined dozens of other individuals who might have been connected to the crimes. Some suspects matched witness descriptions. Others had criminal histories or lived near the attack locations. But none of these leads ever produced enough evidence to close the case. Every promising clue eventually reached a dead end, and the killer continued to remain just out of reach. As the years passed, the Zodiac murders slowly faded from the headlines, but investigators never completely abandoned the case. Files were reopened, evidence was re-examined, and new technologies were used to analyze the letters and physical clues left behind. Still, the identity of the Zodiac Killer remained unknown. Some detectives believed the killer might have died years earlier. Others believed he could have lived an ordinary life, hiding his dark secret forever. Either possibility was unsettling, because it meant the Zodiac might have walked among everyday people without ever being exposed. More than 5 decades have passed since the crimes attributed to the Zodiac Killer first shocked Northern California. The murders, the letters, the cryptic ciphers, all of it became part of one of the most famous unsolved cases in criminal history. And yet, despite decades of investigation, the identity of the Zodiac Killer has never been proven. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, police departments across California worked tirelessly to find the killer. Investigators examined witness statements. They analyzed fingerprints. They compared handwriting samples from the letters sent to newspapers. Hundreds of potential suspects were questioned, but every promising lead eventually faded. No arrest was ever made. Over time, the case slowly grew colder, but the mystery itself never disappeared. Years later, advances in forensic science gave investigators new hope. DNA testing, which did not exist during the original investigation, allowed detectives to re-examine evidence from the letters. Some researchers hoped that traces of DNA on stamps or envelopes might finally reveal the killer's identity. Several samples were tested, but the results were inconclusive. The DNA recovered was either incomplete or possibly contaminated. Even modern science could not solve the puzzle. The identity of the Zodiac Killer remained hidden. Because the case remains unsolved, countless theories have emerged over the years. Some people believe the killer was someone investigators already questioned. Others believe the real Zodiac may never have been suspected at all. There are also theories suggesting the killer may have died long ago. If that is true, the truth might have disappeared with him. But there is another unsettling possibility. The Zodiac Killer might have lived an ordinary life, working a normal job, living among neighbors who had no idea who he really was. A terrifying thought for many people. Even today, the Zodiac case continues to capture the public's imagination. Books, documentaries, and films continue exploring the mystery. One well-known example is the movie Zodiac, which brought renewed attention to the investigation and the people who spent years trying to solve it. The reason the story remains so powerful is simple. Most criminal cases eventually reach a conclusion. The killer is identified, justice is served, but this case never had that ending. And that unresolved question continues to haunt investigators and true crime enthusiasts alike. Somewhere in the past, a man carried out a series of terrifying crimes. He sent letters mocking the police. He challenged the public with secret codes. And then, almost as mysteriously as he appeared, he vanished. Was he ever close to being caught? Did investigators overlook the crucial clue? Or did the man known as the Zodiac Killer manage to outsmart everyone? The answer remains one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history. Now we want to hear from you. Who do you think the Zodiac Killer really was? Was it one of the suspects investigators already examined, or someone completely unknown? Share your theory in the comments below. And if you enjoyed deep true crime investigations like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe, because the next mystery we explore might reveal a secret even darker than this one.